No one saw it coming. In a cafeteria where fear usually spoke louder than any conversation, silence dropped so fast that even the old-timers stopped chewing, and all because of a newcomer and a gesture no one in that place would ever dare to make. The scene didn't even look real. A new inmate sitting alone, her uniform still showing the creases of her first night inside, staring at her food tray as if she were anywhere else in the world, anywhere but here. She was calm. Too calm. Was it courage, naivety, or something far more dangerous? Her stillness bothered the brute of the block, a man known for turning the cafeteria into his personal stage. He strutted toward her with that "I own this place" swagger, while the other inmates watched with a mix of anticipation and caution, an expression you only see right before someone makes a very big mistake. Eyes met for a split second before everyone looked away, as if they all sensed something outside the normal prison script was about to happen. The new inmate stayed seated, holding her chopsticks firmly, not in a fighting stance, not as a threat, but with the quiet precision of someone who thinks 3 moves ahead. It was only a small detail, but enough to put an odd tension in the air. There was no fear in her eyes, only focus. A level of focus so sharp that anyone who understood the unwritten rules of that place found it unsettling. The brute, assuming she was frozen in fear, decided to show who's boss the same way he always did, by turning the moment into a spectacle. He lifted a bottle and poured the contents over her head, expecting her to break, stand up, scream, lash out, anything remotely human. But she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply let the water drip down her face and kept her posture exactly the same, as if none of it mattered. That lack of reaction rattled even those used to watching his antics. It was as if the newcomer had erased the whole unwritten script of the room. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just breathed and continued. Slowly, the brute's confidence began to crack. What should have been a moment of public humiliation flipped completely. The cafeteria realized the fragility they expected wasn't there. She wasn't an easy victim. She wasn't clueless. She wasn't, in any way, what he assumed. The men who always lingered behind the brute, his shadows, his backup, started exchanging uneasy looks, trying to figure out what exactly had gone wrong. Even while they tried to keep their intimidating posture, it was obvious something didn't add up. Her presence shifted the air. Her calmness was so heavy, it felt like its own kind of force. With water still sliding down her face, the new inmate finally lifted her eyes. Just that. One single movement. And it was enough to flip the entire energy of the room. There was no arrogance in her stare, no anger, just a silent warning, a warning so clear that the brute lost half a breath. He stepped back, barely a half step, almost nothing. But in that place, even the smallest retreat meant everything. And everyone saw it. Her victory didn't come from a fight or a dramatic explosion. It came from something far stronger, the public acknowledgement that he had messed with the wrong person. And worse, he realized it far too late. The cafeteria stayed silent. A silence so heavy, it felt like it pushed against the walls. The new inmate adjusted her chopsticks between her fingers, calmly, as if she were simply picking up her meal where she left off. That was the final blow. Not physical. Not violent, but absolute. That simple, quiet, unshaken gesture made everyone understand that she wasn't the one humiliated. He was, and from that moment on, rumors started spreading. Rumors about who she really was, where she came from, and what kind of power could be hiding behind that supposed fragility. No one was sure of anything, but everyone knew one thing. The brute tried to intimidate the new girl, and ended up exposing himself in front of everyone. And this story was only just beginning. The prison where it all happened wasn't just a building wrapped in fences and bars. It was its own ecosystem, governed by silent rules that were never written down, but everyone learned fast, sometimes through fear, sometimes through pain, and almost always by watching closely. The cafeteria, where that now famous scene unfolded, was the heart of this ecosystem. That was where influence was defined, alliances formed, debts created, and where people learned quickly who to avoid and who could move through the room without being questioned. At the center of that brutal universe reigned the man who had tried to intimidate the newcomer. He was known by many names, none of them flattering. To some, he was simply the Brute. To others, he was the living symbol of what it meant to survive in that wing. His muscles were carved from years of hard labor, his leadership born from raw force, and his status built on intimidation. His stare alone could shut down a conversation. His presence could freeze even the most restless inmates. But that day revealed something no one expected. Even he could be dismantled by something other than physical strength. He could be challenged by someone who simply refused to play his game. And that someone was the new inmate. No one really knew her real name. Her file listed only 4 initials and a number. Even so, rumors spread as fast as the curious glances that began traveling through the block. Some said she came from a place where discipline was taught like breathing. Others believed she'd trained in martial arts long before prison. A few claimed she'd survived things far worse than anything anyone there could imagine. But none of it was confirmed. The only undeniable truth was what everyone had witnessed. She wasn't ordinary. The way she held her chopsticks with precision, control, and quiet firmness did not go unnoticed. Not by the veterans of the block, and especially not by the Brute's entourage, who kept their distance while studying her closely. She didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't dart around the room. Every gesture she made was deliberate, minimal, and disciplined. The girl, sitting at the next table, who had seen everything up close, was so struck by what happened that she couldn't stop watching her, with a new kind of attention. Not fear, hope. The newcomer seemed to carry something that most people in that place had lost over time, the ability to resist the pressure of the environment without folding. The prison itself seemed to respond to her presence in a symbolic way. The hallways felt sharper, as if her arrival had disrupted the invisible rhythm that dictated everyone's behavior. Guards who used to overlook small conflicts suddenly became more alert. Inmates who rarely paid attention to anyone now whispered questions to each other, trying to piece together the identity of this enigmatic figure. The Brute, no matter how hard he tried to act normally, couldn't hide his discomfort. His authority, built over years of intimidation, had just been shaken, not by a fight, but by a single look that exposed his insecurity in front of everyone. He knew he'd need to rebuild his image, and he also knew it wouldn't be easy with her around. From that moment on, her name, or what little anyone knew of it, circulated like a warning, something between respect and caution. Inmates who once avoided eye contact now wanted to understand who she was. Maybe she was someone who could change the entire dynamic of the place. Maybe she had survived things so severe that everyday intimidation meant nothing. Maybe she was someone no one should ever provoke. This awareness created a new atmosphere in the prison. Something that started as a whisper but grew stronger by the minute. The entire environment seemed to shift, recalibrating itself, because for the first time in a long time, someone had stood up to the Brute, without even standing at all. But the most intriguing part was still on its way, because while everyone speculated about who she was, the newcomer's real secret was far from being revealed, and her presence in that prison wasn't accidental or random. She had a purpose, and that purpose was about to come to light very, very soon. The cafeteria had resumed its routine, but only on the surface. Beneath the mechanical rhythm of trays sliding, spoons clattering, and muffled chatter, something much deeper was unfolding. It felt as if everyone were waiting for the newcomer's next move, not because she'd said anything, but because her silent presence triggered reactions no one could control. She was the kind of person who changed a room simply by being in it. In the hallways, the bottle incident had already turned into 3 different versions. In one, the newcomer had stared straight through the brute as if she could see beyond him. In another, she had shifted her posture just enough to make him hesitate. In a third, she had spoken, no one knew what, and that alone had made him back off. None of the retellings were fully accurate, but all carried the same undeniable truth. He tried to intimidate her, and she came out on top. For the brute, that was unacceptable. He couldn't afford to let anyone interpret it as weakness. So he spent the entire day wrestling back control of the story, nudging conversations, dropping comments, trying to twist what everyone had witnessed with their own eyes. But the harder he tried, the worse it got. The whole prison had already made up its mind. Her stare had won. And he knew that if he didn't act, he'd lose respect. And in prison, respect is everything. Tension grew as movement in the corridors shifted. Small groups formed quietly, watching every step the newcomer took as she went about her routine as if nothing had happened. She walked with a calm so deliberate it felt almost calculated, placing her feet with precision, always aware of her surroundings. No one could ignore it. She wasn't careless. She was alert, fully present, and it unsettled a lot of people. The girl who had been sitting beside her in the cafeteria, still shaken by what she'd seen, tried approaching her that afternoon. She moved slowly, careful not to come across as intrusive or afraid, guided by pure curiosity. When she finally gathered the courage to speak, the newcomer simply lifted her eyes. She didn't say a word, but she didn't push her away either. She just observed her, and those who witnessed it described that look as more analytical than defensive. That was the moment the brute appeared. He came with an entourage, as always. 2 of his most loyal followers walked behind him, far enough not to draw attention from the guards, but close enough to show they were present. He stopped in the hallway, right at the spot the newcomer would have to walk through. His intention was obvious. The bottle episode wasn't over. The entire corridor went on alert. No one stepped in, but everyone slowed down. Several conversations died mid-sentence. Others, upon noticing the setup, quietly changed direction. The tension in the air was so thick that even light noises seemed amplified. The newcomer walked toward them, and as if she were completely detached from the pressure filling the hallway, she kept her pace steady. Her eyes were locked forward, as if she'd decided no obstacle, not even a man used to intimidating half the block, deserved her attention. When she got close, the brute did what he thought would salvage his reputation. He tried a psychological jab, a verbal provocation, short, clean, but dripping with arrogance. Something meant to prove he was still in charge. But that's when the real conflict began. The newcomer stopped, not out of hesitation, out of intention. The silence deepened. His followers shifted their weight, expecting something significant. The girl beside her instinctively stepped back. The whole corridor seemed to hold its breath. She raised her face, no fear, no doubt. Just something no one could name. She looked right at him, so directly, so deeply, that it was like she drained the power he thought he had. The brute tried to hold his stance, but his shoulders betrayed a flicker of nerves. His breathing sped up just slightly, and everyone saw it. On any other day, he would have taken a step forward to intimidate, raised his voice, used his size to block her path. But in front of her, he didn't move an inch. Then the newcomer did something no one expected. She broke eye contact first, not as a sign of submission, but like someone finishing a mental evaluation. And she simply walked past him, unhurried, unbothered, without looking back. That gesture, so small, so intentional, hit harder than any physical confrontation could have. It shattered the brute's reputation completely because he'd been given the perfect chance to reclaim control, and couldn't do it. The news spread through the prison just as quickly as the first incident. This time, it wasn't rumor. It wasn't interpretation. It was solid fact. The newcomer had just won round 2 of the conflict, and she didn't even have to raise her voice. That chain of events, first in the cafeteria, then in the hallway, threw the entire prison into a state of silent observation. Every inmate seemed to be trying to decipher who the newcomer really was and what exactly she represented inside that dangerous environment. But while everyone focused on the main conflict between her and the brute, other pieces began shifting quietly around them, revealing subplots that had been hiding in the shadows. The first one involved the guards. In the days before the newcomer arrived, a few guards had mentioned a transfer with a specific purpose. Nothing concrete, just loose rumors no one took seriously. But after the bottle incident, 2 guards began watching her with unusual focus, not the kind that warned of danger, but the kind that suggested calculation, as if they recognized something in the way she carried herself, something that shouldn't be ignored. One of them even wrote something on a clipboard as she walked by, immediately triggering suspicion among the inmates who paid attention to details. The second subplot came from the group opposing the brute. In a prison built on silent hierarchies, there's always someone waiting for the right chance to bring down whoever is in power, and his retreat in front of the newcomer was a green light for those rivals. 2 inmates known for planning long, strategic moves started watching her, not out of curiosity but out of opportunity. They didn't want to attack her or test her. They wanted to understand how she had destabilized someone so feared, because that could be the key to shifting the power dynamics of the entire wing. The third subplot unfolded among the women in their cells. The girl who had witnessed everything in the cafeteria, the one who flinched when the water was poured, began following the newcomer with an unexpected kind of quiet devotion. Not idolization, identification. Something in the newcomer's posture had awakened a courage inside her that had been buried for a long time. And she wasn't the only one. Eyes began meeting across hallways as if the newcomer's presence had sparked a collective flame of resistance. Something new, something that hadn't existed there for months, maybe years. But the fourth subplot was the most important and the most dangerous. It came from the newcomer herself. Because while the brute was losing control and scrambling to rebuild his image, she behaved like someone who already understood the place. Her walks weren't random. She paid attention to details no one else cared about. Guard shift patterns, quieter routes, repeated behaviors among certain inmates, blind spots in the cameras, specific moments when noise rose or fell. It was as if she were studying. But studying what? Or who? The inmates began whispering that she wasn't just defending herself. She was analyzing. She was waiting. She was, maybe, preparing for something none of them could predict, and that behavior raised more questions than answers, feeding everyone's curiosity. On the brute side, the complexity took another turn. After realizing his authority was falling apart, he started behaving less impulsively, which ironically made everything more dangerous. He stopped confronting her directly and began watching from a distance. His followers were instructed not to act without his permission, and that alone was rare, very rare. He had never been the kind of man who stepped back to think, but now he was stepping back. And when a violent mind goes quiet, it's always a bad sign. But not all subplots were rooted in threat. There was also an unexpected rise of empathy, something almost forbidden in that place. The newcomer, even without interacting, triggered small but powerful changes. Inmates began acting in slightly more united ways. Tiny acts of resistance started appearing. Whispers of courage floated between tables, as if her presence had opened a mental space that didn't exist before. And before anyone realized it, her presence was affecting not just individuals, but the emotional structure of the entire wing. The brute was losing territory. The guards were suspicious. The inmates were intrigued. And she, with her calculated silence, moved exactly at the pace she wanted. But no one imagined that all of this was just the beginning. Not the guards, not the inmates, not even the brute. The real reason she was there was still hidden. waiting for the right moment to reveal that nothing, absolutely nothing, was a coincidence. The turning point began forming long before anyone noticed. It wasn't explosive, and it wasn't a direct confrontation. It was subtle, almost invisible, but powerful enough to rearrange the emotional structure of the entire wing. The newcomer, with her calculated silence and unnervingly steady posture, had already shaken the leader of the dominant group. But her true impact was about to surface in a way no one, absolutely no one, could have predicted. It started late in the afternoon. The routine was the same as always. Controlled movement, footsteps echoing through the hallways, guards switching shifts, inmates heading back to their cells. The atmosphere was tense but stable. It looked like it would be just another day following the prison's rigid, repetitive rhythm. But the stability cracked the moment the brute decided to act differently. He wasn't alone. 3 of his most loyal followers appeared discreetly, but not too close. He'd learned from his previous mistakes. No public attack, no unnecessary witnesses. This time, he wanted to rebuild his reputation without risking another humiliation in front of the entire wing. The strategy was simple: corner her. Not with force, but with presence. And the chosen location was the narrowest hallway in Block B, a place where echoes swallowed voices and no one walked through without checking both sides. The plan didn't involve overt aggression. It couldn't. A guard could appear at any moment. All he wanted was to pressure her, intimidate her, push her until she showed even a flicker of fear. One misstep, one retreat, one tremor. That would be enough to restore a piece of his authority. But the newcomer seemed to have been expecting exactly that. When she appeared in the hallway, she was alone. Her steps were steady, her eyes sharp. But the most curious detail was something else entirely. She had chosen that hallway herself, the narrowest, the quietest, the most strategic. It was as if she had guided the situation there on purpose. He stepped in front of her. 2 others showed up behind her. The 4th stood to the side, blocking the exit. Anyone else would have frozen. It was a perfectly calculated psychological trap. He didn't need to touch her. Just forming that human barrier gave him the visual and territorial upper hand. But she didn't step back. The newcomer stopped right in the center of the corridor, not behind, not ahead, but in the perfect spot where she could see every angle around her. Her breathing stayed even, her shoulders didn't twitch, her gaze locked straight onto the brute, as if she were analyzing not just his stance, but his intentions, his fears, his insecurities. And for the first time since the cafeteria, he realized something unsettling. She wasn't the one trapped. They were. Was there a camera behind her? Did the echo carry far enough to alert guards? Were the angles of the corridor strategically unfavorable for him, not for her? Those questions began to chip away at his confidence. Before anyone could say a word, footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway. 2 guards appeared, more attentive than usual. They walked slowly, scanning the scene. They didn't see anything overtly wrong, but they sensed something wasn't right. The brute tried to play it off, but they picked up on his nervousness. As the guards passed, the newcomer glanced at them briefly. She didn't ask for help, didn't signal anything. But the shocking part was that the guards recognized her, and not as just any inmate. Their expressions shifted. One of them made a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, like someone acknowledging the presence of a person who mattered, and that single detail shattered the balance. The guards walked away, but the tension they left behind was suffocating. The brute's followers exchanged uneasy looks, unable to understand why 2 guards reacted to her that way. But the brute understood. And it was the worst kind of realization inside a prison. The threat of someone silent, institutional, unseen, someone who might not be just another inmate. Maybe she'd been sent there for a purpose. Maybe she had access to information no one knew about. Maybe she had authority none of them possessed. And that thought destroyed the last remnants of control he believed he had. The newcomer took one step forward, a slow step, a steady step, a step that made his followers move aside without even realizing it. She said nothing. She didn't provoke. She didn't threaten. She simply walked past him as if she had just completed a step in a plan she'd understood from the beginning. When she disappeared around the corner, the brute felt his leadership crumble for good, because in that moment he finally understood what no one else dared admit. The newcomer wasn't just strong. She wasn't just fearless. She was there for a reason. And that reason was about to trigger the biggest turning point in the history of that prison. The fallout from what happened in that hallway spread through the prison like a silent, devastating wave. No one needed to retell the story. The brute's posture alone, when he returned to the yard, was enough for everyone to understand something serious had gone down. He looked smaller. Not physically, emotionally. The man who used to walk with his chest puffed and his stare commanding now carried a trace of uncertainty on his face, as if an invisible shadow followed him. His followers, once so sure of themselves, started behaving differently. They still walked together, but without the same arrogance. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of loyalty, it was the silence of discomfort, almost fear, like they suddenly felt the weight of a responsibility they had never wanted, standing beside someone who was no longer invincible. Meanwhile, the women in the wing whispered among themselves. Some approached the newcomer discreetly, just to watch her from a distance, the way someone studies a force they don't fully understand. Others kept their distance, not out of fear, but respect. Her presence had become a turning point. She hadn't spoken a single word, yet her posture alone had spoken loudly enough to redefine the behavior of everyone around her. The guards, on the other hand, seemed uneasy as well. Those who had been in the hallway during the confrontation exchanged information quietly. One whispered something to the block supervisor, who then wrote a note down. Nothing was said openly, but it was clear the newcomer had caught the administration's attention, not as a problem, but as a point of interest. Every so often, the guard's eyes met hers, and something was different there. It wasn't suspicion, and it wasn't hostility, but a kind of silent recognition. As if they were watching someone who hadn't entered that place simply as another inmate, as if they knew there was a story behind her, something not listed in the official records. And that only made the inmates even more curious. But what truly shook the prison's balance was the brute's reaction. For years, he had built his reputation on the idea that no one could stand up to him. But that day, he lost twice. First in the cafeteria, then in the hallway. And that second loss was much worse because it didn't happen in front of everyone. It happened in front of himself. He realized he wasn't feared the same way anymore. Not because he'd become weak, but because the newcomer had exposed a truth no one in that place ever admitted. Sometimes strength isn't in shouting, size, or aggression. Sometimes real strength is in silence, and that destroyed him on the inside. The murmurs around the prison shifted. Before, they said, "He runs this place." Now they said, "She's not afraid of him. She knows something. She's different." Those whispers became fuel for the inmates' curiosity and for the guards' discomfort. Everything inside that prison seemed to be slowly reorganizing itself, as if her arrival had moved pieces on a board no one dared to touch for years. And at the center of it all, she stayed calm. During rec time, she stood leaning against a far wall, observing the yard with an analytical gaze. She didn't seek company, but she didn't avoid eye contact either. She held her posture firm, tilting her head slightly when nearby conversations caught her attention, as if absorbing everything around her. The girl who had approached her before tried again. This time, she succeeded. "Why didn't you react to him?" she asked quietly. The newcomer didn't take her eyes off the yard. She didn't smile, didn't sigh. She just answered, "Because he wasn't the bigger problem." The sentence, short and surgical, spread through the wing like a spark. What did that mean? Who or what was the bigger problem? And how did she know? When the brute heard the phrase being repeated by the inmates, he completely unraveled. For the first time, he understood he was no longer the center of tension. He wasn't the focus of the stories, nor the symbol of power. Now everyone wanted to know about her. Everyone wanted to understand where she came from. Everyone wanted to know what she knew, and he knew nothing. That psychological blow was the harshest he could possibly receive. There was no physical wound, but something far worse, the loss of silent authority. And he knew that if he didn't act fast, it would soon be too late. But what he didn't know was that the newcomer had already predicted his reaction, and she was prepared for his next move. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but once it finally became visible, no one could ignore it. The newcomer's presence split the prison into two eras, before her and after her. Not because she sought attention, but because every gesture she made created a subtle shift, like silent ripples cutting through the wing's rigid routine. That sentence, "He wasn't the bigger problem," took root like a seed. And as it spread through whispers, curiosity, and psychological impact, the newcomer kept moving at her own pace. She didn't need to explain anything or prove her strength. Her very existence there, wrapped in that unsettling calm, was enough to alter the energy of the entire place, and slowly she began to inspire something even rarer in that prison: growth. Some inmates started approaching her, not to form survival alliances, but to observe, to learn. It was like watching someone who had mastered a different kind of strength, a strength that didn't rely on violence, but on control. In a wing where everyone tried so hard to look strong, she was the only one strong enough not to show it. The girl who had witnessed the cafeteria incident, now clearly the closest to the newcomer, began changing too. Once withdrawn, always shrinking into corners to avoid being noticed, she now walked with her head just a little higher. Nothing flashy, nothing bold, just more sure of herself. One afternoon, as the two sat together in the yard, the girl quietly admitted, "Since you got here, I feel like I can breathe differently." The newcomer turned her head slightly, absorbing the sentence. She didn't answer with words, but the fact that she stayed there, allowing the girl's presence beside her, was answer enough. A new kind of bond took shape, one that didn't rely on explanations, only presence. The growth wasn't only among the inmates. The prison itself was changing. The guards, long accustomed to constant conflict, began noticing a curious decline in petty fights. Not because someone was forcing peace, but because the tone of the wing had shifted. When silent authority takes hold, it rearranges everything around it, and that was exactly what was happening. The brute, however, wasn't experiencing any sort of growth. He was falling, a slow, painful, inevitable fall. With each passing day, his name lost weight. His followers drifted away, not out of betrayal, but out of fear of being associated with someone whose respect had evaporated. In prison, reputation is built on perception, and the current perception was simple. He wasn't in charge anymore, but the most painful part wasn't losing authority over the wing. It was realizing his downfall hadn't come from a physical fight, but from someone who never lifted a hand against him. He tried to recover, he really did, but every attempt collided with the same invisible wall, her gaze, a gaze that didn't mock, didn't provoke, didn't taunt, a neutral gaze, steady, unshakable, a gaze that stripped away every mask he wore. While he sank, she rose, not in power but in influence, not in intimidation but in respect. Inmates started asking her for help with small things, from understanding guard schedules to coordinating yard time. She never took command, but she offered guidance with just a few words, enough to show she understood that place better than any new inmate possibly should. Her rise began to draw serious suspicion from the guards. One of them commented to the supervisor, "She adapts too fast. That's not normal." The supervisor, an experienced man with a sharp eye, replied, "Maybe she's not adapting. Maybe she's just remembering how it works. The phrase landed like a weight, and it confirmed what many already suspected. She had never been just another inmate. Meanwhile, the newcomer continued her own internal path of growth, but not in a traditional sense. She wasn't seeking status, strength, or admiration. Her growth came from focus, discipline, and the ability to maintain control in an environment designed to strip control from everyone. And that posture created something even more powerful: collective confidence. The inmates began organizing themselves with better balance. Conflicts that once erupted daily became rare. Small acts of injustice, like stolen food or subtle humiliations, were faced with firm stares. Her presence was reshaping the wing in ways no guard, no leader, no brute had ever managed. And the more this happened, the more space the brute lost. He no longer had people to intimidate, no one left to follow him, no one willing to obey. And that pushed him toward an unthinkable decision, one that would completely shift the course of the story in the chapters ahead. Because his fall hadn't hit bottom yet, and her rise had only just begun. The days that followed carried an atmosphere so heavy it felt like the air itself struggled to move through the corridors. The entire prison sensed that something was about to happen. It wasn't a simple intuition, it was a collective certainty. A silent discomfort that rippled through the yard, the dorms, the cafeteria, like invisible waves of tension. The routine stayed the same, but no one was truly at ease. Even the flickering fluorescent lights seemed to blink differently. The newcomer watched everything with her usual calm, but there was something new in her eyes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't stress, it was readiness. As if she were lining up invisible pieces, mentally adjusting every step to come. She knew the brute's behavior had changed, and not in a normal way. He wasn't trying to intimidate anymore. He was hiding, and men like him only hide when they're preparing to do something big and desperate. The brute, meanwhile, was living a nightmare he never imagined facing. The loss of control gnawed at his mind minute by minute. That phrase, "he wasn't the bigger problem," echoed inside his head like a sentence he couldn't silence. He began walking the halls looking over his shoulder, something he had never done before. His followers started acting cautiously, realizing he was no longer the leader they knew. And when a leader loses his own shadow, he loses everything. The block supervisor, an experienced observer, noticed the gradual collapse. The guards' reports all said the same thing. The atmosphere was strange, tensions were building, and the newcomer's presence was influencing everyone's behavior. He called in 2 senior officers for a private talk. "She's made more impact here than any transfer in years," one guard said. "And without lifting a finger," another added. But the supervisor didn't look irritated. He looked prepared, as if he had expected this effect from the very beginning, and that only reinforced the idea that her arrival was no accident. Meanwhile, rumors spread among the inmates. Some claimed the newcomer had been trained in some kind of special program before being imprisoned. Others believed she was undercover, there to investigate something. A few even whispered that she hadn't committed any crime at all, that the entire situation was part of a hidden internal operation. But no one got close enough to ask. Because the kind of strength she carried wasn't the kind that explains, it's the kind that observes. Tension reached new heights when the brute disappeared for several hours. For someone so loud and confrontational that silence was taken as a clear sign he was planning something. His followers avoided talking about it, but the fear stamped on their faces said enough. When he finally reappeared, there was a look on his face that no one liked. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was conviction. The conviction of someone willing to risk everything to reclaim what he lost. And that was the exact moment the newcomer noticed. She was sitting on a concrete bench near the yard when he crossed through the gate. Their eyes met for just 1 second, a single second that told her something inevitable was coming. The entire environment seemed to feel the shift. The girl who always stayed close to her approached, uneasy. "You felt that, didn't you?" She didn't answer, but her silence carried more weight than any reply. The wind shifted. The brute's heavy footsteps echoed louder. The inmates' eyes turned toward the newcomer. Even the guards, used to monotony, placed their hands on their belts, alert. It was as if everyone knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Nothing would be the same afterward. And at that moment the newcomer stood up, slowly, without hurry, without fear, without hesitation. It felt like the entire prison held its breath at once. The brute took 2 steps toward her. The newcomer took 1 step toward him, and the world seemed to stop. Right there, in that exact point between them, the inevitable climax of a story that began in silence was about to reach the only place where real truths are revealed. Face to face, as equals, as enemies, as 2 pieces of a fate that neither of them could escape anymore. The entire yard hung in suspension. It was as if time had lost the ability to move forward while the 2 of them walked toward each other. There were no shouts, no rushing, no chaos, just a silence so deep that even the sound of the wind felt amplified. Every inmate watched, some pretending not to, others openly mesmerized. Even the guards, though trying to maintain neutrality, were more alert than ever. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, even those who would never admit it, not even under pressure. When the newcomer stopped, she was only a few steps away from the brute. He tried to hold himself like a leader, shoulders squared, jaw tight, but something in his eyes had changed. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't arrogance, it was fear. Not ordinary fear, but the kind that appears when someone finally realizes they're not facing what they thought they were facing. He took a deep breath, trying to pull himself together. She didn't move a muscle. The contrast was brutal. While he battled inside to keep his mask intact, she remained in a nearly meditative state, like someone who already knew how the story ended long before it began. Her posture didn't show defiance, only control. Absolute, unshakable control. The brute tried to speak first, but his voice cracked. Frustration crossed his face. He was used to dominating spaces with words, with presence, with intimidation. But all of that was falling apart in front of someone who didn't need to raise her voice or her fists or even hint at a threat to command respect. When he finally managed to force the words out, they sounded weaker than he intended. "You think you won?" The newcomer blinked slowly, not out of mockery, out of certainty. "I'm not playing the same game as you," she replied in a neutral tone. The sentence hit him like a verdict. The entire yard felt the impact. Inmates shifted, nervous, trying to absorb every gesture, every word. Even the girl who always stayed near the newcomer held her breath. The brute stepped forward. She remained still. "You messed everything up here," he said, voice shakier now. "You messed up my reputation, messed up my name, messed up my whole block." The newcomer took 1 step, slow, calculated. That single step shattered what little security he had left. "I didn't do any of that," she said. "You built an empire that collapses with a single look." Silence grew unbearable. Some inmates instinctively stepped back, feeling the weight of her words. The guards exchanged glances, realizing this was far beyond a normal prison conflict. He tried to react, tried to regain, just for a second, that aura he'd worn for years. "You don't know who I am," he muttered, grasping for authority. The newcomer tilted her head slightly. Her gaze was deeper now, like she was seeing straight through him. "I know exactly who you are. The problem is, you don't know who I am." That was the final shift. The psychological blow that made the brute lose the ground beneath him. Not physically, internally. His strength had always come from the illusion of control. But how do you control someone who doesn't react to fear? Someone who doesn't play by intimidation rules? Someone who walks through chaos as if chaos has no power at all? He realized in that moment that he wouldn't win. Because she wasn't fighting against him. He was fighting against her, and those are two very different battles. The tension stretched for a few more seconds, until the newcomer breathed in and said, with a calm tone that echoed louder than any shout, "It's over, not for me, but for what you are in here." Everyone saw it, and it was true. Everyone had seen it. The brute finally stepped back. Not running, not stumbling, just a retreat so emotionally transparent that the entire wing understood. His authority ended right there. He was the one who broke eye contact first, a small gesture, but one that sealed his fate in that prison. The newcomer turned around, walked across the yard as if nothing had happened. The whole world seemed to watch her steps, and for the first time in a long time, that place breathed differently. Inmates exchanged looks, filled with a mix of admiration and relief. Guards mentally recorded every detail of what they had just witnessed, and the brute stood still, trying to understand when, exactly, he had lost everything, and why. The answer was right in front of him. He underestimated someone he never should have underestimated. And that's how, without shouting, without violence, without breaking any rule, the newcomer delivered the most iconic moment that prison had ever seen. The moment the most feared man in the block was shattered not by force, but by someone he assumed would be easy to crush. But she was anything but easy. The prison felt different that late afternoon. There were no shouts, no commotion, none of the constant unrest that usually ruled the corridors. The air itself felt strange, too light for such a heavy place, as if everyone had finally understood something that had always been hidden in the shadows of that institution. The newcomer walked across the yard the same way she always did. Steady steps, controlled breathing, sharp eyes. But now, something new followed her movements. Not fear, not suspicion, respect. Silent, natural, almost involuntary respect. Everyone understood that from that moment on, she held a different place in that story. A place not earned through force, but through presence. A place no one dared challenge. Across the yard, the brute stood motionless, still trying to understand how a single person had dismantled years of reputation without raising her voice. He was no longer the same. The aura he carried, the dominance, the intimidation, had evaporated like smoke. The prison looked at him differently now, as if they were seeing not the leader he once was, but a man finally confronted with the truth about himself. And that truth was simple. He controlled nothing anymore. In the days that followed, the routine continued as usual, but with a visible shift. Fights decreased. Hostile stares became more calculated. Silent abuses lost force. The internal dynamic had reorganized itself, as if an invisible piece had been removed from the board and replaced with another, far more stable. The newcomer never sought leadership, and maybe that's exactly why she became one. She didn't give speeches, didn't draw attention to herself, didn't try to take anyone's place. But her presence, that was enough to keep the entire wing aligned. The influence she held wasn't imposed, it was organic, it was consequence. The girl who always followed her now walked with more confidence, not because she felt protected, but because she finally saw her own worth. And that shift began spreading to other inmates too. They stood up more, shrunk less, made choices with greater awareness. It was as if the newcomer's arrival had brought an unexpected kind of emotional freedom to those women. The guards noticed the change as well. They didn't say anything openly, but the looks they exchanged made it clear. They knew. They knew she had come with a purpose. They knew she didn't end up there by accident, and they knew her presence was changing everything, for the better. In the end, what happened wasn't one person defeating another. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The prison would never be the same because someone showed that power isn't in shouting or threatening or intimidating. Power is keeping control when everyone around you loses it. Power is resisting without striking back. Power is refusing to let fear decide who you are. And she proved that in every glance, in every silence, in every step she took. The newcomer entered as a stranger. She became a legend, and the man who tried to humiliate her in front of everyone ended up teaching the prison its greatest lesson. When night fell, the prison sank into the kind of silence that only comes after a definitive shift. The newcomer sat in her cell, watching the faint light slip through the bars, while rumors about her echoed down the halls. The brute, alone in the empty yard, finally understood that he hadn't just lost control, he had lost himself. And in that contrast of shadows and fading light, one truth became clear to everyone. That day marked the end of a reign, and the beginning of a new order. A silent order, a steady order, an unshakable order. If you enjoyed this story and want more intense narratives like this, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the video reach more people. Subscribe to the channel to follow each new episode and become part of a community that grows every day. Tell us in the comments what you thought of the final twist and which character stood out to you the most. Share this story with someone who loves tales full of tension, mystery, and resilience. And remember, there's more tomorrow. Don't miss it.